If you do know that here is one hand, we'll grant you all the rest. When one says that such and such a proposition can't be proved, of course that does not mean it can't be derived from other propositions. Any proposition can be derived from other ones, but they may be no more certain than it is itself. On this, a curious remark by H. Newman. From it seeming to me or to everyone to be so, it doesn't follow that it is so. What we can ask is whether it can make sense to doubt it. If, e.g., someone says, I don't know if there's a hand here, he might be told, look closer. This possibility of satisfying oneself is part of the language game. It's one of its essential features. I know that I am a human being. In order to see how unclear the sense of this proposition is, consider its negation. At most, it might be taken to mean, I know I have the organs of a human, e.g. a brain, which, after all, no one has ever yet seen. But what about such a proposition as, I know I have a brain? Can I doubt it? Grounds for doubt are lacking. Everything speaks in its favor, nothing against it. Nevertheless, it is imaginable that my skull should turn out empty when it was operated on. Whether a proposition can turn out false, after all, depends on what I make count as determinants for that proposition. Now, can one enumerate what one knows, like more? Straight off like that? I believe not. For otherwise the expression I know gets misused. And through this misuse, a queer and extremely important mental state seems to be revealed. My life shows that I know, and am certain there is a chair over there, or a door, and so on. I tell a friend, e.g., hey, take that chair over there, shut the door, etc., etc. The difference between the concept of knowing and the concept of being certain isn't of any great importance at all, except where I know is meant to mean I can't be wrong. In a law court, for example, I am certain could replace I know in every piece of testimony. We might even imagine it's being forbidden to say I know there. A passage in Wilhelm Meister where you know or you knew is used in the sense you were certain, the facts being different from what he knew. Now, do I, in the course of my life, make sure I know that here is a hand, my own hand, that is? I know that a sick man is lying here? Nonsense. I'm sitting at his bedside. I'm looking attentively into his face. So I don't know then that there is a sick man lying here? Neither the question nor the assertion makes sense, any more than the assertion I am here, which I might yet use at any moment if suitable occasion presented itself. Well, then is 2 times 2 equals 4 nonsense in the same way, and not a proposition of arithmetic, apart from particular occasions? 2 times 2 equals 4 is a proposition of arithmetic, not on particular occasions nor always, but the spoken or written sentence, 2 times 2 equals 4, in Chinese might have a different meaning or be out and out nonsense. And from this it is seen that it is only in use that the proposition has its sense. And I know that there's a sick man lying here, used in an unsuitable situation, seems not to be nonsense, but rather seems matter of course, only because one can fairly easily imagine a situation to fit it. And one thinks that the words I know that are always in place where there is no doubt, and hence even where the expression of doubt would be unintelligible. We just do not see how very specialized the use of I know is. For the phrase I know seems to describe a state of affairs which guarantees what is known, guarantees it as a fact. One always forgets the expression, I thought I knew. For it is not as though the proposition, it is so, could be inferred from someone else's utterance, I know it is so, nor from that utterance together with its not being a lie. But can't I infer it is so from my own utterance? I know, etc.? Yes, and also there is a hand there follows from the proposition he knows that there's a hand there. But from his utterance, I know, it does not follow that he does know it. That he does know takes some showing. It needs to be shown that no mistake was possible. Giving the assurance I know doesn't suffice, for it is after all only an assurance that I can't be making a mistake, and it needs to be objectively established that I am not making a mistake about that. If I know something, then I also know that I know it, etc. amounts to, I know that means I am incapable of being wrong about that, but whether I am so needs to be established objectively. Suppose now I say, I'm incapable of being wrong about this. That is a book, while I point to an object. What would a mistake here be like? And have I any clear idea of it? Saying I know often means I have the proper grounds for my statement. So if the other person is acquainted with the language game, he would admit that I know. The other, if he is acquainted with the language game, must be able to imagine how one may know something of the kind. The statement, I know that here is a hand, may then be continued, for it is my hand that I'm looking at. Then a reasonable man will not doubt that I know, nor will the idealist. Rather, he will say that he was not dealing with the practical doubt, which is being dismissed. But there is a further doubt behind that one, that this is an illusion has to be shown in a different way. Doubting the existence of the external world does not mean, for example, doubting the existence of a planet, which later observations prove to exist. Or does G.E. Moore want to say that knowing that here is his hand is different in kind from knowing the existence of the planet Saturn? Otherwise, it would be possible to point out the discovery of the planet Saturn to the doubters and say that its existence has been proved, and hence the existence of the external world as well. G.E. Moore's view really comes down to this. The concept know is analogous to the concepts believe, surmise, doubt, be convinced, in that the statement I know X can't be a mistake. And if that is so, then there can be an inference from such an utterance to the truth of an assertion. And here the form I thought I knew is being overlooked. But if this latter is inadmissible, then a mistake in the assertion must be logically impossible too. And anyone who is acquainted with the language game must realize this. An assurance from a reliable man that he knows cannot contribute anything. It would surely be remarkable if we had to believe the reliable person who says, I can't be wrong, or who says, I am not wrong. If I don't know whether someone has two hands, say whether they've been amputated or not, I shall believe his assurance that he has two hands, if he is trustworthy. And if he says he knows it, that can only signify to me that he has been able to make sure, and hence that his arms are, e.g., not still concealed by coverings and bandages, etc., etc. My believing the trustworthy man stems from my admitting that it is possible for him to make sure. But someone who says that perhaps there are no physical objects makes no such admission. The idealist question would be something like, what right have I not to doubt the existence of my hands? And to that the answer can't be, well, I know that they exist. But someone who asks such a question is overlooking the fact that a doubt about existence only works in a language game. Hence, we should first have to ask, what would such a doubt be like? And we don't understand this straight off. One may be wrong, even about there being a hand here. Only in particular circumstances is it impossible. Even in a calculation, one can be wrong. Only in certain circumstances, one can't. But can it be seen from a rule what circumstances logically exclude a mistake in the employment of rules of calculation? What use is a rule to us here? Mightn't we in turn go wrong in applying it? If, however, one wanted to give something like a rule here, then it would contain the expression, quote, in normal circumstances, quote. And we recognize normal circumstances, but cannot precisely describe them. At most, we can describe a range of abnormal ones. What is learning a rule? This. What is making a mistake in applying it? This. And what is pointed to here is something indeterminate. Practice in the use of a rule also shows what is a mistake in its employment. When someone has made sure of something, he says, yes, the calculation is right, but he did not infer that from his condition of certainty. One does not infer how things are from one's own certainty. Certainty is, as it were, a tone of voice in which one declares how things are, but one does not infer from the tone of voice that one is justified. The propositions which one comes back to again and again, as if bewitched, these I should like to expunge from philosophical language. It's not a matter of G.E. Moore's knowing that there's a hand there, but rather we should not understand him if he were to say, quote, of course I may be wrong about this, quote. We should ask, what is it like to make such a mistake as that? E.g., what's it like to discover that it was a mistake? Thus we expunge the sentences that don't get us any further. If someone is taught to calculate, is he also taught that he can rely on a calculation of his teachers? But these explanations must, after all, sometime come to an end. Will he also be taught that he can trust his senses, since he is indeed told in many cases that in such and such a special case you cannot trust them? Rule and exception. But wait, can't it be imagined that there should be no physical objects? I don't know. And yet saying there are physical objects is nonsense. Is it supposed to be an empirical proposition? And is this an empirical proposition? Quote, there seem to be physical objects, quote. The sentence, A is a physical object, is a piece of instruction which we give only to someone who doesn't yet understand either what A means or what physical object means. Thus it is instruction about the use of words, and the term physical object is a logical concept, like color, quantity, and so on. And that is why no such proposition as there are physical objects can be formulated. Yet we encounter such unsuccessful shots at every turn. But is it an adequate answer to the skepticism of the idealist or the assurances of the realist to say that there are physical objects is nonsense? For them, after all, it is not nonsense. It would, however, be an answer to say this assertion or its opposite is a misfiring attempt to express what can't be expressed like that. And that it does misfire can be shown. But that isn't the end of the matter. We need to realize that what presents itself to us as the first expression of a difficulty or of its solution may as yet not be correctly expressed at all. Just as one who has a just censure of a picture to make will often at first offer the censure where it does not belong, and an investigation is needed in order to find the right point of attack for the critic. Now, regarding knowledge in mathematics, here one has to keep on reminding oneself of the unimportance of the inner process or state and ask, why should it be important? What does it matter to me? What is interesting is how we use mathematical propositions. This is how calculation is done. In such circumstances, a calculation is treated as absolutely reliable, as certainly correct. Upon stating, I know that here is my hand, there may follow the question, how do you know? And the answer to that presupposes that this can be known in that way. So instead of, I know that here is my hand, one might say, here is my hand, and then add how one knows. Saying, I know where I am feeling pain, or I know that I feel it here, is as wrong as saying, I know that I am in pain. But saying, I know where you touched my arm is right. One can say this, he believes it, but it isn't so. But not this, he knows it, but it isn't so. Does this stem from the difference between the mental states of belief and of knowledge? No. One may, for example, call mental state what is expressed by tone of voice and speaking, by gestures, etc. It would thus be possible to speak of a mental state of conviction, and that may be the same whether it is knowledge or false belief. To think that different states must correspond to the words believe and know would be as if one believed that different people had to correspond to the word I and the name Ludwig, because the concepts are different. What sort of proposition is this? Quote, we cannot have miscalculated that 12 times 12 equals 144. It must surely be a proposition of logic. But now, is it not the same, or doesn't it come to the same as the statement 12 times 12 equals 144? If you demand a rule from which it follows that there can't have been a miscalculation here, the answer is that we did not learn this through a rule, but by learning to calculate. We got to know the nature of calculating by learning to calculate. But then can it be described how we satisfy ourselves of the reliability of a calculation? Oh yes, yet no rule emerges when we do so. But the most important thing is the rule is not needed. Nothing is lacking. We do calculate according to a rule, and that is enough. This is how one calculates. Calculating is this, what we learn at school, for example. Forget this transcendent certainty, which is connected with your concept of spirit. However, out of a host of calculations, certain ones might be designated as reliable once and for all, others as not yet fixed. And now, is this a logical distinction? But remember, even when the calculation is something fixed for me, this is only a decision for a practical purpose. And when does one say, I know that A times B equals C? When one has checked the calculation. What sort of a proposition is, quote, what could a mistake here be like? Quote, it would have to be a logical proposition, but it is a logic that is not used, because what it tells us is not learned through propositions. It is a logical proposition, for it does describe the conceptual, linguistic situation. This situation is thus not the same for a proposition like at this distance from the sun there is a planet, and here is a hand, namely my own hand. The second can't be called a hypothesis, but there isn't a sharp boundary line between them. So one might grant that Moore was right if he's interpreted like this. A proposition saying that here is a physical object may have the same logical status as one saying that here is a red patch. For it is not true that a mistake merely gets more and more improbable as we pass from the planet to my own hand. No, at some point it has ceased to be conceivable. This is already suggested by the following. If it were not so, it would also be conceivable that we should be wrong in every statement about physical objects, that any we ever make are mistaken. So is the hypothesis possible that all the things around us don't exist? Would that not be like the hypothesis of our having miscalculated in all our calculations? When one says perhaps this planet doesn't exist and the light phenomenon arises in some other way, then after all one needs an example of an object which does exist. This doesn't exist, as for example does that. Or are we to say that certainty is merely a constructed point to which some things approximate more, some less closely? No, doubt gradually loses its sense. This language game just is like that, and everything descriptive of a language game is part of logic. Now, might not saying, I know, I am not just surmising that here is my hand, be conceived as a proposition of grammar? Hence, not temporally. But in that case, Isn't it like saying this? I know I am not just surmising that I am seeing red. And isn't the consequence of saying, so there are physical objects, like saying, so there are colors? If I know X, etc., is conceived as a grammatical proposition, of course the I cannot be important, and it properly means there is no such thing as a doubt in this case. Or the expression I do not know makes no sense in this case. And of course it follows from this that I know makes no sense either. The phrase I know is here a logical insight. Only realism can't be proved by means of it. It's wrong to say that the hypothesis that this is a bit of paper would be confirmed or disconfirmed by later experience, and that in I know that this is a bit of paper, the I know either relates to such a hypothesis or to a logical determination. A meaning of a word is a kind of employment of it, for it's what we learn when the word is incorporated into our language. That's why there exists a correspondence between the concepts rule and meaning. If we imagine the facts otherwise than as they are, certain language games lose some of their importance, while others become important. And in this way, there is an alteration, a gradual one, in the use of the vocabulary of a language. Compare the meaning of a word with the function of an official, and different meanings with different functions. When language games change, then there's a change in concepts, and with the concepts, the meanings of words change. I make assertions about reality, assertions which have different degrees of assurance. How does the degree of assurance come out? What consequences has it? We may be dealing, for example, with the certainty of memory, or again of perception. I may be sure of something, but still know what test might convince me of error. I am, e.g., quite sure of the date of a battle, but if I should find a different date in a recognized work of history, I should alter my opinion. And this would not mean I lost all faith in judging. Could we imagine a man who keeps on making mistakes where we regard a mistake as ruled out and in fact never encounter one? E.g., he says he lives in such and such a place, is so and so old, comes from such and such a city, and he speaks with the same certainty, giving all the tokens of it as I do, but he's wrong. But what is his relation to this error? What am I to suppose? The question is, what's the logician to say here? I should like to say, quote, if I am wrong about this, I have no guarantee that anything I say is true, quote. But others won't say that about me, nor will I say it about other people. Say for months I have lived at address A. I have read the name of the street and the number of the house countless times, have received countless letters here, and given countless people the address. If I am wrong about it, the mistake is hardly less than if I were wrongly to believe I was writing Chinese and not German. If my friend were to imagine one day that he had been living for a long time past in such and such a place, etc., I should not call this a mistake, but rather a mental disturbance, perhaps a transient one. Not every false belief of this sort is a mistake. But what's the difference between mistake and mental disturbance? Or what's the difference between my treating it as a mistake and my treating it as a mental disturbance? Well, can we say a mistake doesn't only have a cause, it also has a ground? I.e., roughly, when someone makes a mistake, this can be fitted into what he knows are right. Would this be a correct way of putting it? If I merely believed wrongly that there is a table here in front of me, this might still be a mistake. But if I believe wrongly that I have seen this table or one like it every day for several months past and have regularly used it, that isn't a mistake. Naturally, my aim must be to say the statements one would like to make here, but cannot make significantly. Perhaps I'll do a multiplication twice to make sure, or perhaps get someone else to work it over. But shall I work it over again 20 times, or get 20 people to go over it? And is that some sort of negligence? Would the certainty really be greater for being checked 20 times? And can I give a reason why it isn't? That I'm a man and not a woman can be verified. But if I were to say I were a woman and then tried to explain the error by saying, oh, I hadn't checked the statement, the explanation would not be accepted. The truth of my statements is the test of my understanding of these statements. That is to say, if I make certain false statements, it becomes uncertain whether I understand them. What counts as an adequate test of a statement belongs to logic. It belongs to the description of the language game. The truth of certain empirical propositions belongs to our frame of reference. G.E. Moore says he knows that the earth existed long before his birth, and put like that, it seems to be a personal statement about him, even if it's in addition a statement about the physical world. Now, it is philosophically uninteresting whether Moore knows this or that, but it is interesting that and how it can be known. If Moore had informed us that he knew the distance separating certain stars, we might conclude from that he made some special investigations, and we shall want to know what these were. But Moore chooses precisely a case in which we all seem to know the same as he, and without being able to say how. I believe, e.g., that I know as much about this matter, the existence of the earth, as Moore does. And if he knows that it is as he says, then I know it too. For it isn't either as if he had arrived at his proposition by pursuing some line of thought which, while it is open to me, I have not in fact pursued. And what goes into someone's knowing this? Knowledge of history, say? He must know what it means to say the earth has already existed for such and such a length of time. For not any intelligent adult must know that. We see men building and demolishing houses, and are led to ask, how long has this house been here? But how does one come to the idea of asking this about a mountain, for example? And have all men the notion of the earth as a body, which may come into being and pass away? Why shouldn't I think of the earth as flat, but extending without end in every direction, including depth? But in that case, one might still say, quote, I know that this mountain existed long before my birth, quote. But suppose I met a man who didn't believe that. Now suppose I replaced G.E. Moore's I know with I am of the unshakable conviction. Can't an assertoric sentence, which was capable of functioning as a hypothesis, also be used as a foundation for research and action? I.e., can it simply be isolated from doubt, though not according to any explicit rule? It simply gets assumed as a truism, never called into question, perhaps not even ever formulated. It may be, for example, that all inquiry on our part is set so as to exempt certain propositions from doubt, if they're ever formulated. They lie apart from the route traveled by inquiry. One would like to say everything speaks for and nothing against the earth's having existed long before. Yet might I not believe the contrary, after all? But the question is, what would the practical effects of this belief be? Perhaps someone says that's not the point. A belief is what it is, whether it has any practical effects or not. One thinks it is the same adjustment of the human mind, anyway. The expression I know has a primitive meaning, similar to and related to I see, wissen, wieder. And saying I knew he was in the room, but he wasn't in the room, is like saying I saw him in the room, but he wasn't there. I know is supposed to express a relation, not between me and the sense of a proposition like I believe, but between me and a fact, so that the fact is taken into my consciousness. Here's the reason why one wants to say that nothing that goes on in the outer world is really known, but only what happens in the domain of what are called sense data. This would give us a picture of knowing as the perception of an outer event through visual rays, which project it as it is into the eye and the consciousness. Only then the question at once arises whether one can be certain of this projection. And this picture does indeed show how our imagination presents knowledge, but not what lies at the bottom of this presentation. If G.E. Moore says he knows the earth existed, etc., most of us will grant him that it has existed all that time, and also believe him when he says he is convinced of it. But has he also got the right ground for his conviction? For if not, then after all he doesn't know. Compare Bertrand Russell. However, we can ask, may someone have telling grounds for believing that the earth has only existed for a short time? Say since his own birth. Suppose he had always been told that. Would he have any good reason to doubt it? Men have believed that they could make rain. Why should not a king be brought up in the belief that the world began with him? And if Moore and this king were to meet and discuss, could Moore really prove his belief to be the right one? I do not say that Moore could not convert the king to his view, but it would be a conversation of a very special kind. The king would be brought to look at the world in a different way. Remember that one is sometimes convinced of the correctness of a view by its simplicity or symmetry, i.e., these are what induce one to go over to this point of view. One then simply says something like, that's how it must be. The propositions presenting what Moore knows are all of such a kind that it is difficult to imagine why anyone should believe the contrary. E.g., the proposition that Moore has spent his whole life in close proximity to the earth. Once more I can speak of myself here instead of speaking of Moore. What could induce me to believe the opposite? Either a memory or having been told? Everything that I have seen or heard gives me the conviction that no man has ever been far from the earth. Nothing in my picture of the world speaks in favor of the opposite. But I didn't get my picture of the world by satisfying myself of its correctness, nor do I have it because I am satisfied of its correctness. No, it is the inherited background against which I distinguish between true and false. The propositions describing this world picture might be part of a kind of mythology, and their role is like that of rules of a game, and the game can be learned purely practically without learning any explicit rules. It might be imagined that some propositions, in the form of empirical propositions, were hardened and functioned as channels for such empirical propositions as were not hardened but fluid, and that this relation altered with time, and that fluid propositions hardened and the hard ones became fluid. The mythology may change back into a state of flux. The riverbed of thoughts may shift, but I distinguish between the movement of the waters on the riverbed and the shift of the bed itself, although there is not a sharp division of the one from the other. But if someone were to say this, so logic too is an empirical science, he would be wrong. Yet this is right. The same proposition may get treated at one time as something to test by experience, at another time as a rule of testing. And the bank of that river consists partly of hard rock, subject to no alteration, or only to an imperceptible one, partly of sand, which now in one place and now in another gets washed away or deposited. The truths which G. Moore says he knows are such as, roughly speaking, all of us know, if he knows them. Such a proposition might be, e.g., quote, my body has never disappeared and reappeared again after an interval, quote. Might I not believe that once, without knowing it, perhaps in a state of unconsciousness, I was taken far away from the earth? That other people even know this, but do not mention it to me. But this would not fit into the rest of my convictions at all. Not that I could describe the system of these convictions, yet my convictions do form a system a structure. And now if I were to say this, it is my unshakable conviction that, etc. This means in the present case too that I have not consciously arrived at the conviction by following a particular line of thought, but that it is anchored in all my questions and answers, so anchored that I cannot touch it. I am, for example, also convinced that the sun is not a hole in the vault of heaven. All testing, all confirmation and disconfirmation of a hypothesis takes place already within a system, and this system is not a more or less arbitrary and doubtful point of departure for all our arguments. No, it belongs to the essence of what we call an argument. The system is not so much the point of departure as the element in which arguments have their life. Suppose some adult had told a child that he had been on the moon. The child tells me the story, and I say it was only a joke. The man hadn't been on the moon. No one has ever been on the moon. The moon is a long way off, and it's impossible to climb there or to fly there. If now the child insists, saying perhaps there's a way of getting there which I don't know, etc., what reply could I make to him? What reply could I make to adults of a tribe who believe that people sometimes go to the moon? Perhaps that's how they interpret their dreams, and who indeed grant that there are no ordinary means of climbing up to it or flying there. But a child will not ordinarily stick to such a belief, and will soon be convinced by what we tell him, seriously. Isn't this altogether like the way one can instruct a child to believe in a God, or that none exists, and it will accordingly be able to produce apparently telling grounds for the one or for the other? But is there then no objective truth? Isn't it true or false that someone has been on the moon? If we are thinking within our system, then it is certain that no one has ever been on the moon. Not merely is nothing of the sort ever seriously reported to us by reasonable people, but our whole system of physics forbids us to believe it. For this demands answers to the questions, how did he overcome the force of gravity? How could he live without an atmosphere? And 1,000 others which could not be answered. But suppose that instead of all these answers we get the reply, we don't know how one gets to the moon, but those who get there know at once that they are there, and even you can't explain everything. We should feel ourselves intellectually very distant from someone who said this. But an empirical proposition can be tested, we say. But how? And through what? What counts as its test? Someone says, but is this an adequate test? And if so, must it not be recognizable as such in logic? As if giving grounds did not come to an end sometime. But the end is not an ungrounded presupposition. It is an ungrounded way of acting. Someone says, well, I know that I have never been on the moon. That sounds quite different in the circumstances which actually hold to the way it would sound if a good many men had been on the moon, and some perhaps without knowing it. In this case, one could give grounds for his knowledge. Is there not a relationship here similar to that between the general rule of multiplying and particular multiplications that have been carried out? I want to say, my not having been on the moon is as sure a thing for me as any grounds I could give for it. And isn't that what G.E. Moore wants to say when he says he knows all these things? But is his knowing it really what is in question, and not rather that some of these propositions must be solid for us? When someone is trying to teach us mathematics, he will not begin by assuring us that he knows that A plus B equals B plus A. If you are not certain of any fact, then you can't be certain of the meaning of your words either. If you tried to doubt everything, you wouldn't get as far as doubting anything. The game of doubting itself presupposes certainty. Instead of saying, I know, couldn't G.E. Moore have said, it stands fast for me that? And further, it stands fast for me and many others. Why is it not possible for me to doubt that I have never been on the moon? And how could I try to doubt it? First and foremost, the supposition that perhaps I have been there would strike me as idle. Nothing would follow from it, nothing be explained by it. It would not tie in with anything in my life. When I say nothing speaks for, everything against it, this presupposes a principle of speaking for and against. That is, I must be able to say what would speak for it. Now, would it be correct to say, so far no one has opened my skull in order to see whether there's a brain inside, but everything speaks for and nothing against its being what they would find there? But if anyone were to doubt it, how would his doubt come out in practice? And couldn't we peacefully leave him to doubt it, since it makes no difference at all? Can one say where there's no doubt, there's no knowledge either? Doesn't one need grounds for doubt? Wherever I look, I find no ground for doubting that X, Y, Z. I want to say we use judgments as principles of judgment. If a blind man were to ask me, "Have you got two hands?" I should not make sure by looking. If I were to have any doubt of it, then I don't know why I should trust my eyes. For why shouldn't I test my eyes by looking to find out whether I see my two hands? What is to be tested by what? Who decides what stands fast? And what does it mean to say that such and such stands fast? I'm not more certain of the meaning of my words than I am of certain judgments. Can I doubt that this color is called blue? My doubts form a system. For how do I know that someone is in doubt? How do I know that he uses the words "I doubt it" as I do? From a child up, I learned to judge like this. This is judging. This is how I learned to judge. This I got to know as judgment. But isn't it experience that teaches us to judge like this? That is to say that it's correct to judge like this. But how does experience teach us then? We may derive it from experience, but experience does not direct us to derive anything from experience. If it is the ground of our judging like this, and not just the cause, still we do not have a ground for seeing this in turn as a ground. No, experience is not the ground of our game of judging, nor is its outstanding success. Men have judged that a king can make rain. We say this contradicts all experience. Today they judge that aeroplanes and the radio, etc., are means for the closer contact of peoples and the spread of culture. Under ordinary circumstances, I don't satisfy myself that I have two hands by seeing how it looks. Why not? Has experience shown it to be unnecessary? Or have we in some way learned a universal law of induction? And do we trust it here too? But why should we have learnt one universal law first, and not the special one straight away? After putting a book in a drawer, I assume it's there, unless, and someone will say, experience always proves me right. There is no well-attested case of a book simply disappearing. Although it has often happened that a book has never turned up again when we thought we knew for certain where it was. But experience does really teach that a book, say, does not vanish away, e.g. gradually evaporate. But is it this experience with books, etc., that leads us to assume that such a book has not vanished away? Well, suppose we were to find that under particular novel circumstances, books did vanish away. Shouldn't we alter our assumption? Can one give the lie to the effect of experience on our system of assumption? But do we not simply follow the principle that what has always happened will happen again, or something like it? What does it mean to follow this principle? Do we really introduce it into our reasoning? Or is it merely the natural law which our inferring apparently follows? This latter it may be. It's not an item in our considerations. When G.E. Moore says he knows such and such, he's really enumerating a lot of empirical propositions which we affirm without special testing. Propositions, that is, which have a peculiar logical role in the system of our empirical propositions.